Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final segment for this week for week 13 and finishing up essentially chapter 7, talking about principles of testing, which we've already talked about, more about the training side of anaerobic power and in relationship of other factors and variables we can be training to enhance anaerobic power and limit injury, limit problems, limit downtime, which is really the kind of the goal, isn't it? We have to give enough recovery to allow us to come back and train more. However, we need to get back in and train more if we're going to get the benefit, but we don't get the benefit unless we recover and have time between. It's always that challenge, and that's kind of what we're facing as we finalize our topics or our discussion of anaerobic power. And you have essentially now a few days off after this, going in through Easter break, and you are not expected to do any work during that time frame, which is why the discussion board post isn't due until next Tuesday. But you do have a paper coming up and your final project coming up as well. And both information by the time you watch this video should be up for everything now in course announcements between the calendar, so you can see the final 3 weeks at a glance, as well as seeing the expectations for the paper, expectations for the project. And the project's really your chance, to be honest, to put together what you know, kind of putting together a prescription for exercise based upon the recognition of supporting the immune system, supporting the hormonal response, supporting nervous system response, cardiorespiratory response, and those kinds of things. So it's really where the first few chapters essentially, and you're utilizing what we know from the final few chapters by the time we're finished with our course to be able to design programs for recognizing what generalities specifically toward helping people, right? I don't expect you to get the nth degree of programming in there, but at the same time, the more you do, and the more it's going to be difficult to be anything less than a top-notch grade for doing so. I'll talk more about that, and there'll be information is posted again in course announcements by the time you see this video. That being said, finishing our topic of anaerobic power, talking about progressive resistance, increasing resistance over time once you've been able to handle a particular load for a given duration and or given duration of time, intensity, I should say, then it's time to consider the possibility of progressing in some capacity, right? There's no absolute progression from one exercise into another. The textbook, the Irvine text, noted specifically talking about depth jumps, and it didn't say this is the absolute way you should do this, but it should note that this is not necessarily the way to progress a given exercise. There are always variable adaptations that are required based upon someone's balance, flexibility, strength, mobility, their endurance, their strength from left to right, left-right symmetry, a previous injury affecting them somehow. There's so many variable factors for why you would actually make adaptations in how you train someone. But the bottom line is we're looking for the least joint stress, coordination, neural demand, least force requirements, and stability needs to start before you progress. Making sure they have basic stability needs met, I should say, before you start progressing someone, like that sample depth jump progression there on page 188 in your text. We don't want that eccentric stress, the damage, or at least the amount of force requirement to be able to slow your body down when you've dropped from a step, and let alone drop from a step and then try to explode back up and jump onto a step again. Difference between a drop jump versus a depth jump. Drop jump is kind of just dropping, or just a drop off a box standing there, versus, or also sometimes it's also to mean sometimes, depending on what source you're referring to dropping off a step and jumping forward. One is to drop off a step, jump up. One is just to drop off a step and land, which is really where it should start. The progressions mentioned in the text are absolutely fine, but you have to take that into context of looking at the skill capacity of the individual, their coordination, their neural demand. Can they handle lesser forces over greater durations of time and for lesser intensities, before you try to find something that's about as eccentrically stressful as it gets from a standpoint of dropping from an object down to the ground and exploding upward again. Make sure we understand that when we say least joint stress, we also mean that you have proper mechanics in how you move, that you have to have proper understanding and recognition of the knee lining up over the toes. And it's not the knee over the second toe or the third toe. It's the knees line up with the toes, and they're symmetrical left to right. If they're not lining up with the middle of your shoe, roughly speaking, then we got some problems when you're landing. Going to put some significant stress toward the inner aspect of the knee, and that's not good at all. We don't want to see that at all. That being said, there are a lot of ways we can look to be progressing someone. Those steps are fair, but you want to make sure that it's consistent with the capacity of the individual we're training. nothing wrong with starting someone with jumping and moving more towards one-legged bounding and whatnot, so on and so forth. But I'm always conscientious of concern, like that's the way. That's certainly the way I trained. When I read something and then a text that seemed to know what they were talking about, and they said to go from this, in this order, that's exactly how I did it. When it was really should be looked at as suggestions for a population of people with variations depending upon actual performance, right? We're always measuring heart rate, RPE, and actual performance pace as it relates to the force output, the speed, tempo, the way they, and the speed of their movement itself, taking all those things into consideration for deciding whether that exercise is appropriate or we need to regress or they're ready to progress, right? Strength improvements in general are expected over for terms of what we expect over 4 weeks to 2 years of training. We're basically talking about pretty interesting kind of to note this. A novice should be expected over a few weeks to a couple years to be increasing their current strength if they're engaging in a regular strength program, which really assumes we're talking about at least a couple times per week of a strength program. The fact of the matter is, if you perform strength exercises once per week, so you're working every basic joint action, all the primary muscle groups within those joint actions, because joint actions are the predominant focus, not the muscle. If you're doing so and you're doing it appropriately, then you can maintain capacity for producing force for many, many months and maybe longer. But to actually improve, we're looking at bare minimum of a couple days a week of significant anaerobic stress from a standpoint of strength training to improve strength, right, over a period of a few weeks. And when we say 4 weeks, as it notes in the text, that's really neural gains. You're not going to be making hypertrophy gains in 4 weeks unless someone is an absolute elite of the elite, in which case they probably already know that, and they wouldn't be talking about them as a novice either, if that's the case, unless they're 12. Right. That being said, intermediate people who have a little more background but not a ton can see moderate improvements. Not surprising; they're already starting from higher level performance, which is exactly what you see. Right? You see the higher level your starting point, the starting a resistance program, the lesser your percentage of improvement. However, the higher advanced you get, smaller improvements make that much more of a big deal. So that elite 2% change would be enough to go from being mediocre to being possibly being a world champion. That's how big of a difference that really is from a standpoint of, like, I think about where I was from a standpoint of being elite high school and mid-level college, and I wanted to be an elite level professional athlete. When it came to running, I was in the top 2%, unquestionably. But the difference between 98th, 99th, and the person who wins everything is a dramatic jump. And there aren't that many people in those categories from the standpoint of the total population, but the differences between all of them are significant. So even a small jump can make all the difference in performance. So these are actually fantastic to know if you think about it from a general perspective, to be able to make those kinds of gains. That's phenomenal stuff. Flexibility and range of motion. Generally speaking, when assessing someone's flexibility, the obvious, you can certainly assess flexibility by basic motion, basic control, which is really where you're looking at mobility. You're not necessarily looking at trying to isolate a given joint for assessing flexibility, although you can. And if you're certainly into deeper levels of physical therapy, this is something that would be normal for you to do. As a coach, not so much. Certainly not out there in the field and work with athletes. You're not going to probably individually measure someone's joint range of motion with a goniometer, but you could certainly do it. Certainly could. In some cases, some coaches do. They decide it's a primary area of importance. That being said, more physical therapy and more when there is an issue of concern over lack of symmetry left to right, looking at left side versus right side, which is a much bigger issue than whether or not someone has flexibility, reasonable level of the norm of flexibility at, like, say, hip flexion. When you go into hip flexion, as you drive your leg upward and the down leg is going into extension, hip extension. When you're pushing off as you're jumping or running, the down leg is going to be going into extension, right? And the hip, upper hip is going to be going to flexion. You should be able to theoretically get 110 to 120 degrees of flexion if you're going to expect any reasonable level of performance for speed and power. However, just because you get 100 degrees doesn't mean you can't be fast and powerful. But would be more concerning is if you have 100 degrees of motion hip flexion on the left side, and the right side you had 110, 115. that 10-15 degrees difference for left to right, and you talk about someone running for long periods or expecting to proceed at high levels of performance for many, many years, there's a good chance injury is going to come, if not already, if it isn't already prevalent, then it will be coming. So trying to find that balance left to right is a much greater concern than whether or not someone achieves what is determined to be the norm of flexibility, even though those norms are there for a reason. Their norms are there because those people who are within the areas of norm for range of motion flexibility wise, and feel free to email me if you need or are looking for specific joint flexibility expectations, because I can put those together for you if you want to see some of those. It would take a little time for me to go digging, and somewhere I have it for every joint expectation for range of motion. You can pretty much look it up too. You can research that to see each one. Even knowing that's a norm, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the absolute. But that being said, for sit and reach, the old school, you put your feet up against the box and you'll reach out as far as you can. You do it 3 times, see how far you can get flexibility wise. The limitations of that test is that it's really assessing the posterior chain flexibility, which is not bad. It's fine. It's like anything else. It's assessing someone's capacity for performance. And there's nothing wrong with doing more and more tests. If someone was to use the sit and reach test as the primary parameter for flexibility, that would be concerning. Because the fact is, if you have a longer torso relative to your lower body, you're going to be able to reach farther, which I always had. People always think I'm a little bit shorter than I really am because I have a slightly longer torso by 1 inch, 2 inches, and a slightly shorter legs for my height by 1 inch, 2 inches compared to the norm. So I'm able to reach an extra 1 inch or 2 inches or more than most people are. And wingspan, someone who has really long arms is going to get much longer reach as well. Which that's why they, of course, have you do a step point where you reach as far as you can go first, or where you are when you're relaxed, and then reaching extensively from there, because they want to assess your limb length, whatnot too. But limb length has to be taken into account in general when measuring flexibility too. Body mass has to play a role too. There's a lot of difference between body mass expectations with flexibility as well. Clearly, the less tissue, there'd be more flexibility. The greater amount of tissue, flexibility is going to be harder to come by. Those things should all be taken into account when assessing flexibility. But when someone's out of the norm, it's worth looking at. How's their performance? How's their past history of injury? How is it affecting them, how they feel on performance? If they're not seeing a drop in performance, they're performing well. This is a period of many months and years, not just a couple of weeks or a few days. And then they'll have no previous injuries, and there's a slight variation left to right, or they're not reaching the norms in a given flexibility area. It's not something to be vitally worried about for the moment, but something to be keeping an eye on. But static flexibility, the ability to maintain your position in space, right? And holding a stretch, versus dynamic flexibility means moving through a full range of motion. The muscle spindle itself, which is basically in the interfusal fibers of the muscle, regulates length and the rate of change in length. So when you bring your arm back into horizontal abduction, the pectoralis major gets a little bit of a stretch. Of course, generally speaking, if you want to stretch something, if you think you know what muscle you're wanting to stretch, you have to know what it does as far as its function and do the opposite to get flexibility. So my pectoralis major doesn't just horizontally adduct me coming across in front, it horizontally, so I have to go into horizontal abduction to get a stretch a little bit, but it also internally rotates your shoulder coming across in. So I have to externally rotate my shoulder as I do so. Pectoralis major is also a fan-shaped muscle. It gets very extensive, right? It's a fan-shaped muscle, so consequently, it can actually be engaged about 30 degrees upward above the horizontal plane or transverse plane, and downward about 10 degrees. A lot of people think they're working their upper pecs or lower pecs. There's no such thing. Or they think if they press fully down or fully up, they're still working pectoralis major. That's not true. It's about 30 degrees upward above the horizontal transverse plane, about 10 degrees below. So when you stretch, you can go down up to about 30 degrees from the horizontal transverse plane, or about 10 degrees up, along with horizontal abduction and external rotation. You have to understand specifically when you go in a given direction what it is you're really stretching if you're going to maximize the benefit from it. Doesn't mean you can't just kind of go to a side, kind of feels kind of good to stretch for a second there. That's not a big deal. Low force, just kind of general motions in general, holding position for a few seconds is not a bad thing at all. But when we're trying to maximize the benefit from our flexibility, it's important to understand that muscle spindle is going to regulate length. So as you go back there and you feel a slight pull, muscle spindle is causing the myotatic reflex or stretch reflex, causing the muscle fibers to fire, which is going to limit your capacity to move any farther being related distance, further being an abstract idea, but farther into range of motion. So for that farther range of motion you're looking for, you would actually hold at that point of first resistance. That's your static stretch place. No pain, just light discomfort. That's what a stretch should feel like. Not pain and grimacing as you're doing it. If you're doing that, you're actually increasing resistance. You're increasing force output. By doing so, the muscle's not relaxing and you're not getting flexibility. A lot of people don't understand that. You don't want to have significant stress. And you also don't get a stretch when you actually have a dumbbell in your hand. Your dumbbell's pulling you back because you're resisting the dumbbell. It has to be something that has about as low load as you can possibly find to get the lightest amount of resistance to get the benefit of a stretch. Otherwise, the muscle's actually activating and flexibility is not what you're getting. You're actually strengthening an isometric position. Okay, which is also what happens in yoga and some exercises where you hold a position for long periods. There comes a point when flexibility is no longer at play. It's more towards isometric strength and stabilization at that point, which is fine. Just make sure you're clear on the goal. But if you want to get a proper length increase, you would go to the point where you'd hold that position for 20-30 seconds, static stretch, and you'd relax, come back and try to go again. And you repeat that several times. Most people don't do that. But that also, if you try to throw a ball and you throw it really fast or with too much force, you're not used to it, feel a little twinge in your shoulder or something like it, or a kick or anything like that. You actually haven't warmed up, you decide to try to run fast, you feel a little twinge. It's a muscle spindle is actually causing that myotatic or stretch reflex, trying to get the muscles to fire to cause you to, don't do that. It's trying to tell you to knock it off, to actually not try to create such great length or create so much length too fast, okay? The Golgi tendon organ regulates tension. You pick up a heavy object and you can feel it sometimes, like that's too heavy and the body just kind of gives. You go to grab the dumbbell off the rack and way too heavy, couldn't pick it up or whatever it might be, and you feel it kind of almost a release. And like, why did the muscle release? I want it to fire. Well, it was trying to protect you. The Golgi tendon organ, which is at the muscle tendon junction for all the different muscles and tendons, and its job or their jobs are to regulate tension. If there's too much tension causes you to relax. Okay, which is also what you're trying to do in a static stretch. You're trying to hold that point of light resistance, whatever it might be, knowing exactly what you should be moving and how you should be moving. Like a calf stretch shouldn't just be dorsiflexion because your calf muscles, your gastrocnemius and soleus plantar flex your ankle. However, because when you tend to dorsiflex, there's a tendency for the ankle to cave and go into pronation. You can't let the ankle cave. You have to maintain the joint position in alignment with that ankle, generally speaking, as well. So all those things have to play a role. It's not just a matter of kind of go into it and hold a stretch. You have to know exactly where you're trying to go, and it's amazing when you know the minute positions for a joint and how finite little positioning can play a role. Slight changes can be a dramatic difference in stretching and benefit from stretching of any kind, whether you're talking about static or dynamic. Dynamic, we would simply go back and forth in horizontal abduction with external rotation and then a little bit up of the horizontal plane, a little bit down, and then we come back across into horizontal adduction and maybe rotate the spine a little bit there too, but just kind of dynamic back and forth, nice and easy, whereas static would be holding for 20-30 seconds, okay? Now, some people say, well, one's more beneficial than the other one. No, it's very much goal specific. There's no question that static stretching has its time and place for most people. Dynamic flexibility seems to make the most sense prior to exercise, whereas static stretching seems to make the most sense post-exercise. But to be really clear, dynamic flexibility could be used post-exercise between sets. So could static stretching. We'll come back to that. But static stretching has gotten a real bad rap. I think the book did a decent job of noting some of the studies and research that's out there, but some of it's very limited in that there are certain parameters they were not looking at in trying to determination whether or not static stretching was appropriate or not. And when someone goes so far as to say static stretching shouldn't be done prior to exercise, it's a very broad statement, which is just untrue on its face. The idea that you are going to limit force production or inhibit force production of a muscle by statically stretching it is not necessarily true. It's only if it's held for too long of a period or held at too high of a force. Okay, those things don't occur. If you hold for 20-30 seconds at low force, just enough light little pull, there's no research to support the idea that's going to limit or inhibit force production immediately following that stretch. That being said, you're still better off with dynamic work. Perfect world, what you do, static stretching, followed by dynamic work. That would be the ideal if time is not a factor. When time is a factor, what often is the case, dynamic flexibility takes precedence in the preparation, the period before training, and it's performed rather than static stretching, which is understandable. But when all the time in the world is prevalent, certainly when I coached basketball, track and field, and cross country, we statically stretched first. Okay, and then we did dynamic work after. So what you essentially do is you loosen everything up and you follow it with activity work to build you back up, getting you ready for the training session itself. That's the ideal right there. But time is a factor. There's no question that's true. Autogenic inhibition is what the static stretch is. You're autogenically inhibiting the muscle by allowing the muscle spindle or the Golgi tendon organ time to override the muscle spindle. And again, after exercise is best, but you could totally do it earlier or between sets. Just got to see how it feels for the individual who's doing it, what kind of benefit they get. Hold that point of first resistance for 20, 30 seconds, repeat it 2 to 5 times. Honestly, maybe 10 times or more, all depending on the need, but not once. Even twice is not very much. Reciprocal inhibition, moving to a controlled full range of motion, dynamically. Anytime is best, but before activity is probably the best time to do it. Don't go ballistic. Ballistic means explosive and uncontrolled. You want to be controlled. Reciprocal inhibition, because when you move into horizontal abduction, you get a stretch on the pectoralis major and a slight activation of your posterior deltoid. And then assuming you actually get the proper motioning positioning of your shoulder while you're doing it too. But that said, the opposite would be true come the other way around. Now you have your shortening of pectoralis major, a light firing, because you're not against resistance, and because technically you're not fighting gravity directly, you're actually standing up while doing this, you're not really getting a lot of strength going on here. Remember, we talked briefly about if you want to maximize the benefit of strength, you must directly oppose the resistance. So consequently, if you're trying to really fully strengthen someone, you know what you're trying to strengthen, you're clear about what joint motion you're trying to strengthen, you better make sure you're directly opposing gravity as much as possible, not at a funky angle, not a push-up on a wall. Nope. Okay, not a push-up on a step, push-up on the ground. If you can't do a push-up on the ground, then find some other chest pressing type mechanism and work on core stability strength. But don't try to angle someone saying, well, this is easier and progressing you toward something that's actually more beneficial. Now, it's more biomechanics, but this relates to physiology as well. It's just going to put a little bit less stress on the body, but it's not going to make you more capable of producing force within what is now essentially a different force altogether. But that said, when we say move controlled range of motion through concentric and eccentric at a constant speed, roughly constant. Okay, there's no such thing as an exactly constant speed. Limitations. Individual bone and ligament structure plays a great role here, and obviously you can say tendon and connective tissue in general. There's a lot of limitations for flexibility. We have to take that into account. Again, body size as well can be noted here as well. Be careful with it. Previous injury and scar tissue, also more cause for concern. Number one thing to do when someone's having pain or discomfort or not moving well. Number one thing, simple answer, slow down. Slow down. And then following slowed down with reducing range of motion. And the third thing is reducing the load. Maybe it's the first thing if you're externally loading. Slow down, reduce range of motion, reduce the load. If those three things don't work, and anything you're doing physically, if you reduce the range of motion, you don't have to go as far. If you reduce the load, you reduce the speed of what you're doing significantly, and it's still difficult, then it's the wrong thing. You've got to find different exercise. Subcutaneous fat, again, size plays a role with this as well. And gender. Women tend to have 10% or more flexibility benefit or gain or capability than do men. Okay. Limits of flexibility, elasticity. We're talking about when the muscle is stretched, something called titin aids return to normal length at the Z disc and the M line for the muscle. Connective tissue contains elastin to aid return to normal length. Stretching it too far can technically cause permanent elongation, reducing joint stability and range of motion. If you have overly elastic ligaments like I have, like my left ankle, from too many injuries to my left ankle, my weaker side, right? There's the exact thing. And maybe if I knew everything about everything I know now when I was 13, I've been different how I maybe looked at everything. That's easier said than done, right? But that's the idea of a good coach. They're aware of things. They know what to do. And unfortunately, I didn't get that kind of training early on. So as much as I did do well with sport and activity, there's some things I probably could have avoided too. And that I have excessively laxive ligaments at my left ankle, whereby I can, if I'm walking, I step wrong, my foot will go and just completely roll out to the outside very quickly. Doesn't usually cause me any injuries, but it causes a little bit of pain. There's just hypermobility at that ankle because of the laxity of ligaments, with numerous ankle sprains, improper rehab. Okay, improper strengthening, stability of the joint by proper motion of the joint and utilization of the joint as a whole to strengthen stability-wise, range of motion-wise, and avoid that permanent elongation. When someone gets an injury, it's vital that rehab properly. And just because the pain goes away, the problem's not necessarily gone, right? Regular stretching of muscles causes intracellular signaling, which is the GTO and the muscle spindle response, allowing the muscle to change size according to demand, within reason, obviously, right? Plasticity. We're talking about extensibility. We're really talking about certain tissues, we don't want to have too much elasticity. Technically, the ligaments are a lot more plastic than the tendons are, excuse me, a lot more plastic than are the ligaments. Your tendons, we don't want to stretch them. When people say, should we stretch tendons or ligaments? No. They move, they allow motion, in particular ligaments allow more motion. Tendons are like a thick rope, and ligaments are like a thick rubber band. There's more elasticity to the ligaments, less to the tendons. They both can stretch a little bit, but the goal is not to try to stretch them. The goal is to understand what they're allowing you to do, to not just stretch to the point of pain or discomfort or forcing something that's not where you're not ready to go. I don't know if you've ever gone to a situation where you were squatting with a heavy weight or something, or chest pressing with heavy weight or something, and then all of a sudden you had heavier weight and you're getting better range of motion deeper. Well, the load's pushing you down. It's forcing you past your own capacity to move, which is going to damage connective tissue. Okay? Proprioceptors, the nervous system response, recognition. One of the reasons why we're supposed to go slow is so we have that sensory information can be sent to the central nervous system, and then it can be returned back to the periphery so our limbs can understand how to fire the right neurons at the right time, fire them in the right sequence, and get the right fibers to fire. Those proprioceptors are continually trying to sense information, but if you move too fast or with too high loads, more than when you're ready, that's when injury typically occurs. The body can't interpret and sense the information and give you feedback quickly enough. You need to give yourself more time with lower loads, lower intensities, lower speeds, longer rest periods if necessary, all the above. Okay. Skeletal muscle damage can range from delayed onset muscle soreness, which is microscopic damage to the fibers. Don't confuse that with tissue remodeling, which is hypertrophy. There is no research to support any concept that you have to get sore or stiff to get bigger muscles. That's just not true. Matter of fact, the less microscopic damage you have with the fibers, the more you'll have better tissue remodeling in terms of being able to handle greater levels of stress, greater hypertrophy over time, theoretically. But certainly there's no research to support the idea that soreness gets you any greater level of hypertrophy than no soreness at all. Okay? Versus PEMS, which is post-exercise muscle soreness. That's the first 24 hours after you train. A little bit of it's typically more to venous pooling, to needing to get return, getting proper blood flow there, proper oxygen and nutrients, rid that bloating, which is the venous pooling, remove lactate, remove excess hydrogen ions, and get back to normal functioning. The cool down should do that. The cool down should alleviate any concerns with the PEMS. DOMS has to do more with a combination of not a proper cool down and far too much intensity or duration of intensity during your training program. Straining a muscle, stretching beyond the capacity of the muscle's ability to lengthen with microscopic disruption to the muscle tendon location. That strain, we've all had them, like a little, oh, that something's not right there. It hurt a little bit. It might bother you for a few days or maybe a couple weeks, but probably days. If it bothers you more than days, it might be something more serious than a strain. There are levels of strains. So certainly within a couple, 2 weeks or so, strain could still be there. But if you're still feeling a strain many weeks later, you might be having a slight pull there rather than a strain, because you're having severing of the fibers or connective tissue, not just a microscopic disruption at that muscle tendon location. That can be avoided with the proper warm-up and proper programming, in addition to gradual, consistent stretching, not forcing the stretch. The greater the force production requirement, the greater the need for flexibility work. Your book notes that. More the power athletes, maximal strength athletes have a greater need for flexibility than do those who are like endurance type athletes who are not engaging as in high of intensities on a regular basis or for higher levels of load on a regular basis. Okay, they may have more greater duration of work, but the intensity, the speed, the output is not as high on a regular, consistent basis, which has a greater need for more focus on flexibility. Stretching-induced force deficit that's incurred after a stretch. A lot of research support the concept or concern, or to look at the concern, I should say, of whether or not stretching inhibits force production immediately following it, a static stretch. And as I mentioned, there's no research to support the idea that when you hold a stretch for 20, 30 seconds, properly autogenically inhibiting a muscle without too much force, very, very light, there's no research to support the idea that it inhibits the muscle to produce any reasonable level of force required for the activity that follows. However, there is research to support the idea when a stretch is held for 45 seconds or longer Longer stretches have shown the propensity to reduce force production immediately following. The text actually notes from the American College of Sports Medicine standards of stretching for 30 to 60-second holds. Those are not wrong, but there's a lot of research supports the idea that there's a possibility when you go beyond 30 seconds, not so much of hurting you flexibility-wise. If you're at the right position with flexibility, with holding that position, then you're not going to get hurt by it. But the longer you hold it, the more you are going to limit short-term force production immediately following it, which is why it's recommended to 20, 30 seconds, maybe closer to 20, okay? And that said, following an activity, stretching a static stretch with dynamic activity is the way to maximize performance. No question about it, okay? That being said, hypermobility, there's a genetic predisposition toward greater joint mobility when someone's hypermobile, typical more to women than men, like we mentioned, 10% more likelihood at some joints and maybe as much as 3 times more likelihood for some women than men to have more hypermobility. The concern is there strength supporting this hypermobility? So if someone has the ability to go into great ranges of motion, their shoulder or their hip or their knee or their elbow, whatever joint area we're talking about, or even spinal extension, you've seen some people have an outrageous ability to extend their spine and like what looks like they bend in half, and just gives me the heebie-jeebies a little bit, to be honest, when someone can do that freakish Cirque du Soleil type stuff, right? That said, if the strength is there, which by the way for Cirque du Soleil people it typically is, if they have this hypermobility and the strength capacity to produce high levels of force to support that joint for a stability perspective and range of motion and control, mobility, and let alone added force production capacity there, then there's less concern about that mobility causing injury. The problem is when the mobility is there, the strength is not. That's a recipe for injury, causing issues with laxity of connective tissue and instability at the joint. Okay. Other forms of flexibility. Massage is a form of flexibility or self-myofascial release. Massage, someone else puts pressure on you physically, and the idea is when they put pressure on you, they're putting pressure at a pressure point. What's actually happening is they're stimulating that muscle spindle response, that first point of like a twinge that starts to happen there, a little tightness, that's the muscle spindle firing up. When someone digs and pushes really hard on you, that shouldn't happen if there was tension before the harder push. If someone starts to push on you, or you do it yourself with a ball, or you're rolling on something, or you're pushing yourself into the wall, anything you do to an object, and you feel a little pressure, like you start to feel that a little bit, like, oh, I'm sorry, I feel a little pressure, a little slight discomfort, just like a static stretch. That's the place you're supposed to maintain the pressure. Maintain it. Don't increase it. It's like saying, this weight, I can barely handle this weight. Give me some more. Why would you do that? It's such a simple concept, and the best massage therapists recognize this. That's why there's only a handful of massage therapists I will go see, because I don't need someone to go dig on me, because they don't understand the concept of what's going on at the internal level, as far as muscles, as far as blood flow, as far as healing and inflammation. They don't understand the concept of muscle spindle to Golgi tendon organ properly, or how to apply those concepts. It's a gradual progression. When someone says, I love deep tissue massage, it's either because they're sadistic and like pain, or because they're so loose already, they can take it pretty hardcore, really serious pressure, and it doesn't bother them so much. That's fine. That's great. It's like any level of progression. But we start with light pressure, not pain. Pain is going to inhibit proper relaxation, proper release, proper GTO overriding the muscle spindle, which is the same response in a massage. Okay, and you do it also for massages. Self-myofascial release or massage should probably be more than minimally 5, 10, 15, 20 plus minutes on a given location for you to really benefit highly from that. It's not something you can do in 1 or 2 minutes unless you do it every single day. Some people will get away with flexibility training or massage, forms of flexibility training other than static stretching, dynamic flexibility, and we're going to talk about PNF. They have to do it more regularly. They can get away with it by doing less of it on a given day. When they don't do it very regularly, they got to put more time in every time they do it. Okay, it's really important to understand the difference there. Proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation or contract relax method. The most common area everybody wants to stretch is their hamstrings, and the hamstrings, honestly, unless you have long femurs, you have structural need for hamstring flexibility, you probably don't need to spend any time, I just said that, probably don't need to spend any time stretching hamstrings. You can do it. It'll relieve your temporary tension, but the typical reason why the majority of people who have tight hamstrings, true of a lot of muscles in the body, by the way, is because of a improper positioning, doing something else, either overusage of a given position or motion. Most likely, in the case of tight hamstrings for the majority of people, they sit all day. So when they stand up to go into hip extension, the hip extensors are elongated. So consequently, what you got is elongated hamstrings and glutes. And so then you try to go into hip extension, they don't fire very well. And that doesn't, when actually the glutes really can't fire properly, you might have a little light elongated hamstrings. I really should say more of the glutes. Glutes can't fire properly. Who takes over? Hamstrings. And then hamstrings get tight. Why are the hamstrings tight? Well, because the glutes couldn't fire properly. Hip flexors are also tight, and the hamstrings now are the only ones that can do any work. So when you start going walking, jogging, or anything, just moving around, you feel a lot of hamstring tightness, and you go stretch your hamstrings, you still got the problem of loose or lax glutes and weak glutes, as well as overly shortened and probably also weak hip flexors, just being shortened in a shortened position for long periods of time. You're much better off stretching hip flexors, strengthening glutes, leaving hamstrings alone. Problem goes away, unless you have long femurs. That's different. And for athletes, typical reason why they get tight issues in general is going for an extra set when they were done. Their body was fatigued and they forced the issue and they strained something. That's typically why they get excessive tightness as a result, or excessive range of motion, trying to overstride when running, overloading when you're fatigued, like a deep squat. All those things can inhibit proper lengthening of a muscle and consequently cause tightness and make you think that's the problem when it's really the way you're training is more the problem. But a PNF stretch is holding the position, so you'll move into a position, they will become a wall and hold you in that spot, and maintain it for 20, 30 seconds, getting autogenic inhibition, getting the chance for the GTO to override the muscle spindle, and the person will release, move into the position again. You, as a person doing the PNF stretching on your person you're stretching out, will move into that spot, hold them there, stay there. You're an immovable wall. And again for another 20, 30 seconds. And then they contract on you, I should say, between sets. I didn't mention that part. They push on you the opposing direction. They're moving away from you to get the stretch. Now they move into it and actually try to contract muscles there. And that's reciprocal inhibition they're trying to get now. And they move away again. So it's a combination of autogenic and reciprocal inhibition concepts at play. Very, very ideal way to stretch someone when you know what you're doing. Please don't do massage on someone or a PNF stretching with someone unless you have specific background working with physical therapists or in our university type settings with someone who knows what they're doing before you actually do that kind of work. It shouldn't be painful. It shouldn't hurt. If the person you're stretching is grimacing, you're not doing it right. Shouldn't be that. Okay. Ballistic stretching is bobbing, bouncing, jerking for explosive type actions. People doing stuff in the back of the plane when I fly internationally, going every which direction really fast. It's possible it may not hurt you. That's what you've done all your life, probably not a big deal. But the idea of being explosively jerking when you're a little tight, that is a good recipe for disaster. So we got to be sure about who's doing this when they're doing it. I see athletes doing all the time. They're bobbing and bouncing around. They're used to it. It's not a big deal. But you don't want the average person trying to be ballistic and explosive with stretching. Increased extensibility desired. Well, stretching causes permanent ligament and tendon laxicity or viscoelastic creep, right? That if you stretch, you cause permanent ligament and tendon laxity potentially. There's no research to support that. Some people still refer to that, and you always could. If you overdo something, excessively stretching, that could happen. It's highly unlikely. But the creep concept is you maintaining certain positions for long periods makes it that much more difficult to go against them. People often say that you're sitting a lot of your day, but you're supposed to be spending 2 times as much time out of your seated position as you're in it. And if you're a regular office worker or whatnot, then that's going to be tough to do. Well, that's why flexibility is going to be hard to come by. You have to be not only doing the work you're supposed to do, but avoiding the work you're not supposed to be doing, right? Final thoughts. So you've got then no worries about this weekend because you got Easter break. I want you to have a fantastic Easter with probably the close group of your family, people you're with, as opposed to traveling. I really hope, again, that you respect the standards that are being set for us for our social distancing and not traveling, not exposing more people to other people, because you can't guarantee what other people are doing. And as long as you can't do that, exposing any of us is likelihood of increasing all of our time expectation in quarantine and increasing the risk on other people, which we don't want to do. It's not just the risk to us. That said, more importantly, I want you to have a great time with your family or your close family, people who are with you on a fantastic Easter, remembering what it's for. And Tuesday, your post is due for week 13. You have another post due at the end of the week. That'll be our final serious post. Then it'll be more doing what have I learned, and of course we'll have one more exam. Again, I'll give you all the questions. I'll give you all the questions for your exam. Okay, I'll give them. It's not giving me an assignment. It's just I'm giving them to you so you can prep. You don't have to turn it back into me, but you'll know what the questions are, and I highly advise you to use them to help you prepare for your exam. I'm going to place it your exam and as a not to be having to be done until basically into finals week. Doesn't mean you have to wait that long. You can do it whenever you want. It'll be available the last week of class, and you can wait all the way till for a 2-week period, or you can do it right away. If you're able to do everything early, fantastic. Your paper is only a few pages, but you got to do some significant research with a few research supporting articles to write a good paper. Those guidelines are there in the course announcements. Email me if you have questions about content for your paper. You want to write a paper that can be reasonably discussed in 5 pages, a concept that doesn't seem to be needing 50, 60, 100, 150 pages, right? And of course your project, which is basically you designing a program for someone. Those of you who had me in Kin 406 already, it's not the same. This is much more in depth. So the expectation is talking not so much about, whereas Kin 406 was program designed for someone who exercise program for someone who is untrained versus trained. And that's not what we're doing now. I'm not asking you to design exercises and sets and reps and all that stuff. That's not what we're going for here. We're going for more generalities, but more broad-based. How do you enhance hormone response? How do you enhance immune system response? How do you enhance nervous system response? Cardiorespiratory benefit, musculoskeletal benefit, that kind of work. And I'll be a little more clear on that in course announcements. Have a good Easter break. I wish you well. We'll talk to you again soon.